I've lived with my dad for as long as I can remember. Mom died when I was really young, I was barely 4 years old. The house we lived in belonged to my grandparents, Mom's parents. After Mom died, Dad didn't date for a long time. Sure, there were a few women here and there when I was around 12, but nothing serious. Just coffee dates and occasional dinners out while I stayed with a babysitter. None of them ever came to our house, and Dad never seemed particularly excited about any of them. Everything changed when I turned 14. By then, both my grandparents had passed away too, and it was just Dad and me in that big house. That's when he met Sandra. "Ruby, honey, I want you to meet someone special," Dad said one evening. He had this nervous smile on his face that I'd never seen before. "This is Sandra." Sandra was tall and elegant, with perfectly styled blonde hair and manicured nails. But what caught my attention were the two people standing behind her, her kids. "These are my children," Sandra said with a practiced smile. "James is in his first year of college, and this is Melissa, she's 16. James barely looked at me, too busy texting on his phone. Melissa, though, she made eye contact all right. Later that same day, she cornered me in the kitchen. "Look," she said, crossing her arms. "Just because our parents are dating doesn't make us sisters or friends or whatever. Let's keep our distance, okay?" Things moved fast after that. Within 6 months, Dad and Sandra were married, and they all moved into our house. It was weird how quickly our spacious home suddenly felt cramped. James took over the guest room, Melissa got the study that we converted into a bedroom, and Sandra's stuff seemed to multiply overnight, filling every available space. The bathroom situation became a nightmare. Either Sandra was in there doing her hour-long beauty routine, or Melissa was hogging it for her endless selfie sessions. I started waking up an hour earlier just to make sure I could shower before school. But I didn't complain. Not when I saw how Dad's face lit up every time Sandra walked into the room. Not when he started humming while making breakfast, or when he actually started leaving work on time to have dinner with all of us. He was happy, really, genuinely happy, for the first time since Mom died. Everything changed when Dad got his big promotion. He came home one evening, practically bouncing with excitement, his tie loose around his neck and a huge grin on his face. "Regional Sales Director," he announced during dinner. "Can you believe it?" Sandra immediately started talking about buying a new car and renovating the kitchen, but I was stuck on the part where Dad mentioned extensive travel. Turned out extensive meant he'd be gone for weeks at a time, sometimes even a month. The first time Dad left for a business trip, the change in Sandra was like a switch being flipped. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, she turned to me with this look I'd never seen before. "Ruby," she said, her voice stern. "We need to establish some ground rules while your father is away." Those ground rules turned out to be a long list of chores and restrictions. I had to be home by 4:30 p.m. sharp, no exceptions. Not even for study groups or school activities. "But I have volleyball practice on Thursdays," I protested. "Then you'll have to quit," Sandra replied without missing a beat. "Someone needs to help with dinner and housework." The first few days were rough. I'd rush home from school, barely having time to catch my breath, before Sandra started barking orders. "The floors need mopping, Ruby. These windows are filthy, Ruby. Start chopping the vegetables for dinner, Ruby." Meanwhile, Melissa would sprawl on the couch, phone in hand, giggling at whatever her latest boyfriend had texted. James was rarely home, but when he was, he'd leave his dishes in the sink and his laundry for someone else to do. One evening, while scrubbing pots while Melissa watched TikTok videos at full volume, I finally spoke up. "Why doesn't Melissa have to help with any of this?" Sandra's head snapped up from her magazine. "Melissa needs to focus on her college preparations. She can't waste time on housework." "But she's just what?" Sandra's voice had that dangerous edge to it. I glanced at Melissa, who was now filming herself doing some dance trend, definitely not studying. "Nothing," I mumbled, turning back to the dishes. The worst part wasn't even the endless chores or the unfair treatment. It was how Sandra would completely transform whenever Dad called or came home. She'd put on this exhausted act, slumping in her chair and sighing dramatically. "Oh, honey, you have no idea how hard it's been," she'd say when Dad walked through the door. "Managing the house all by myself, taking care of everything." And Dad, sweet, oblivious Dad, would kiss her forehead and pull out some gift he'd bought during his trip, a designer handbag, expensive perfume, or jewelry that probably cost more than all my belongings combined. "You're such a trooper," he'd say, while she preened and showed off her latest present to Melissa. "I don't know what we'd do without you." I'd stand there in the background, my hands raw from cleaning, homework still waiting to be done, watching this performance play out. Sometimes I caught Melissa smirking at me from behind her phone, but I kept my mouth shut. What was the point of saying anything? Dad was happy, successful, and in love. The years crawled by, and before I knew it, I was in my senior year of high school. James had graduated college 2 years ago, but was still living at home, claiming he was looking for the right opportunity. Mostly this meant playing video games in his room and occasionally going on interviews that mysteriously never worked out. Melissa was in her 3rd year at the local college, which meant she too was still at home, maintaining her reign over the bathroom and continuing her tradition of never lifting a finger to help. My 18th birthday came around in early spring. I didn't expect much. Sandra had made it clear that excessive celebration wasn't necessary. "We'll just have a small family dinner," she announced, not bothering to look up from her phone. "No need to waste money on a big party." I tried not to think about Melissa's 18th birthday 2 years ago. That had been a whole different story, a rented venue, professional catering, DJ, and about 100 guests. Sandra had spent weeks planning it, making sure every detail was perfect. Dad was home for my birthday dinner at least, though he left for another business trip the next day. "Sorry, princess," he said, hugging me goodbye. "Duty calls. We'll celebrate properly when I get back." I focused on graduation prep after that, finalizing college applications, ordering my cap and gown, the usual senior year stuff. Everything seemed normal until that dinner, about a week after Dad left. We were all sitting around the table, me, Sandra, James, and Melissa. I was pushing my peas around my plate, trying to tune out Melissa's endless chatter about her latest drama with her boyfriend, when Sandra cleared her throat. "Ruby," she said, folding her hands on the table. "We need to have a serious conversation." I perked up, thinking maybe she wanted to discuss college plans. I'd been avoiding the topic with her, but maybe she was finally showing some interest in my future. "Now that you're 18, she continued, her voice syrupy sweet, "you're legally an adult. And adults have responsibilities. Starting next month, you'll need to pay rent. $500 per month seems fair." I literally choked on my mouthful of food. James thumped me on the back, looking amused. I looked around the table. James and Melissa were both smirking, clearly enjoying the show. "And what happens if I can't pay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sandra's smile widened. "Well, then you'll need to find somewhere else to live, won't you? We can't have freeloaders in this house." I sat at the dinner table, my food now completely cold, as Sandra's words hung in the air. The unfairness of it all, the years of being treated like a servant while her children lounged around, and now this, something inside me finally snapped. "So let me get this straight," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. "James, who graduated college 2 years ago and spends his days playing video games, doesn't have to pay rent. Melissa, who's in her 3rd year of college and has never done a single chore in this house, also doesn't have to pay rent. But I do? I've made the decision that my children don't need to pay rent while they're getting established," Sandra replied, dabbing her mouth with a napkin. A strange sort of calm came over me then. Maybe it was all the years of bottled-up frustration, or maybe it was just time for the truth to come out. I felt myself smile, not my usual attempt to keep the peace smile, but something different, something that made Sandra's own smile falter slightly. "Well, that's interesting," I said, leaning back in my chair. I won't be paying rent because this is my house. The silence that followed was deafening. Then James started laughing, followed by Melissa's high-pitched giggle. Sandra joined in too, but her laugh had an edge to it. "What are you talking about?" she asked between chuckles. "This house belongs to me," I repeated, not breaking eye contact. "My grandparents put it in my name before they died." The laughter died as they took in my expression. Sandra's face went through a series of emotions: amusement, confusion, disbelief, and finally, something close to panic. "That's ridiculous," she spluttered, reaching for her phone. "I'm calling your father right now." Her manicured nails tapped aggressively at the screen as she put the phone on speaker. The dial tone seemed to echo through the kitchen. "Hello?" Dad's voice crackled through the speaker. "David," Sandra's voice was tight, controlled. "Ruby is telling some interesting stories about the house. She claims it belongs to her." "That's not true, right?" The silence on the other end stretched for what felt like forever. "David?" Sandra's voice rose slightly. "Well," Dad cleared his throat. "Actually, my in-laws put it in Ruby's name before they passed." "I didn't think." "You didn't think to mention this?" Sandra was practically screeching now. "How could you not tell me this?" "I didn't think it was important," Dad said weakly. "It never seemed relevant." "Not relevant?" Sandra's face was turning an interesting shade of red. "Not relevant that your teenage daughter owns our house?" She hung up before Dad could respond, nearly throwing her phone onto the table. The kitchen was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. James and Melissa were staring at me like they'd never seen me before. Sandra took several deep breaths, visibly trying to compose herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was artificially bright, though I could hear it trembling slightly. "Well," she said, forcing a laugh that sounded more like a hiccup. "This has all been a big misunderstanding. Of course you don't need to pay rent, Ruby. Let's just forget this whole conversation happened, shall we?" I'd lost my appetite completely. Without a word, I stood up and left the kitchen, heading for the stairs. As I climbed to the second floor, I could hear urgent whispers coming from below, Sandra's harsh whispers mixing with James and Melissa's agitated voices. By 6 the next morning, I was already awake, staring at my ceiling and thinking about how everything had changed in just a few hours. Around 7, I heard movement downstairs, the familiar sound of Sandra making her morning coffee. I was about to head down for breakfast when I heard her voice floating up from the living room. She was on the phone, her tone hushed but intense. "David, you need to do something about this situation," she was saying. "Your daughter can't just. We need to get her to leave." I froze on the stairs, holding my breath to hear better. "I know it's her house, David," Sandra continued, frustration evident in her voice. "But she's making things difficult. She doesn't fit in here anymore. She's becoming a problem." There was a pause while Dad spoke. Even from where I stood, I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "But Sandra, it is her house. I can't just kick her out." "Nobody's talking about kicking her out." Sandra's voice took on that syrupy sweet tone she used when she was manipulating someone. "We just need to guide her in the right direction." "What about those colleges she applied to? The ones in other states? You could encourage her to go to one of those. Tell her it would be good for her independence." My stomach clenched as I heard Dad's response, "Maybe you're right. I'll talk to her about moving away for college. It might be better for everyone." I waited until Sandra hung up before walking into the kitchen, keeping my face carefully neutral. I busied myself with getting a bowl and some cereal, pretending I hadn't heard anything. James and Melissa shuffled in shortly after, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Sandra swept in last, her phone still in hand. "Good morning, everyone," she said brightly, as if last night had never happened. We all sat there, the only sound the crunching of cereal and the occasional clink of spoons against bowls. And then, as casually as if I was commenting on the weather, I said, "By the way, starting next month, you'll all need to start paying rent." Sandra's piece of toast stopped halfway to her mouth. James dropped his phone into his cereal bowl. Melissa's spoon clattered against her bowl. "Excuse me?" Sandra's voice was barely a whisper. "Rent," I repeated, taking another bite of my cereal. "I'm thinking, $500 per person seems fair. That's what adults do, right? They pay their own way?" Sandra's face had gone pale, then red. She coughed, clearly having inhaled some of her coffee. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious." But we're family," Sandra sputtered, her composure cracking. "Family doesn't charge family rent." That's not how things work." "Wasn't it you who just yesterday demanded that I pay rent?" I asked, still maintaining my calm demeanor as I stirred my cereal. Sandra's face flushed. She set her coffee cup down with a sharp click against the table. That was different. I was trying to teach you about financial literacy. To prepare you for the real world." I couldn't help but laugh at that. Financial literacy? The real world? That's interesting coming from someone who's been living rent-free in someone else's house for 4 years. "Now listen here," James started, but I cut him off. "No, you listen. You graduated college 2 years ago. You don't have a job. You spend all day playing video games and eating food that I help pay for with my part-time job. Maybe it's time for you to learn about financial literacy too." I turned to Melissa. "And you? When was the last time you even did your own laundry? How dare you?" Sandra's voice was rising. "After everything I've done for this family." "What exactly have you done?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Made me do all the housework while your kids did nothing? Tried to charge me rent for my own house? Plotted with Dad this morning to try to get rid of me?" Her eyes widened. You were listening?" "I heard everything," I confirmed, pushing my bowl away. "And you know what? Maybe you're right. Maybe it is time for some changes around here. So here are your options: either start paying rent, all of you, or find somewhere else to live." Sandra's face turned an alarming shade of red. This is revenge. You're just a spiteful, cruel child who's jealous of my children." "Paying rent?" Melissa scoffed, finally finding her voice. "Or what? Are you going to kick us out of the house?" "You ungrateful little brat." James joined in, standing up so fast his chair fell backward. "After we welcomed you into our family." "Your family?" I kept my voice level, even as they all started shouting. "This is my house. My grandparents' house. You're the ones who moved in here, remember? You'll regret this," Sandra hissed, pushing away from the table. "You have no idea what you're doing. James, Melissa, pack your things. We're leaving." I watched in silence as they stormed off, thundering up the stairs. Sandra paused at the doorway, turning back to me with eyes full of venom. "You'll pay for this," she spat. "Your father will hear about everything." I just sat there, finishing my now soggy cereal, as the sound of drawers slamming and angry muttering filtered down from upstairs. Within an hour, they had thrown some bags together and were stomping out the front door. Sandra didn't even bother closing it behind her, just stormed out to her car with James and Melissa in tow. The house felt strange in its newfound silence. I wandered from room to room, straightening things they'd left askew in their hurried departure, trying to process everything that had happened. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that my phone rang. Dad's name flashed across the screen. I took a deep breath before answering. "Hello? What the hell do you think you're doing?" Dad's voice exploded through the speaker. I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "Sandra just called me in hysterics. How could you be so cruel?" Something inside me snapped. After years of trying to keep the peace, of staying quiet, of being the good daughter, I'd had enough. "Cruel?" I cut him off mid-rant. "That's interesting, Dad. Where was all this concern about cruelty when your wife tried to charge me rent for living in my own house? Did you think that was kind?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Dad spoke again, his voice was quieter, uncertain. What are you talking about? Sandra, never. Don't. My voice was shaking now. Don't you dare pretend you didn't know. I heard you on the phone with her this morning, Dad. When she was trying to convince you to make me move out, and you agreed to it. Remember that conversation? The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically see him squirming, the way he always did when caught in a lie. Ruby, honey, you don't understand. He seemed to gather himself, and suddenly his voice hardened again. You're destroying this family, Ruby. Is that what you want? Sandra is threatening to divorce me over this. I sank down onto the couch, the same couch where Melissa used to sprawl for hours while I did her share of the housework. She says she'll divorce you unless I apologize? For what? For owning my own house? For standing up for myself? She's my wife, Dad's voice cracked. She says either you apologize for how you treated her and her children, or she's leaving me. Is that what you want? To ruin my marriage? I looked around the living room, at the photos on the walls, mostly of Sandra's family now, with just one small picture of Mom still tucked away in the corner. When I spoke again, my voice was steady. I'm not apologizing, Dad. Not for this. The line went dead, he'd hung up on me. My graduation day came and went like a blur. The ceremony was beautiful, but the empty seats in the family section felt like a physical weight on my chest. My best friend Sarah's parents took photos of us together and invited me to their celebration dinner. They didn't mention the obvious absence of my family, but their hugs lasted a little longer than usual. I spent the next couple of days sorting through college acceptance letters and trying to figure out my next steps. The house felt both empty and peaceful, until a familiar car pulled into the driveway one afternoon. Dad got out first, followed by Sandra, James, and Melissa. They looked like they were headed to a business meeting rather than visiting family, all dressed up and wearing identical stern expressions. I met them at the door before they could knock. Ruby, Dad said, his voice formal. Sandra stood just behind his shoulder, nodding encouragingly like he was a puppet and she was pulling the strings. We've come to resolve this situation. I leaned against the doorframe, waiting. I'm willing to forgive your recent behavior, he continued, choosing his words carefully. We can all move back in and things can go back to normal. But you need to apologize to Sandra and her children for how you treated them, and of course, drop this ridiculous idea about rent. I looked at each of their faces, Dad's forced smile, Sandra's smug expression, James and Melissa's matching sneers. For years of memories flashed through my mind, countless nights of doing their chores, being treated like a servant, watching Dad slowly turn into someone I barely recognized. No, I said simply. Dad's facade cracked. Then you leave me no choice. If you can't be reasonable about this, if you can't be part of this family, then I'm done. I'm leaving, and I'm disowning you. Is that what you want? I felt oddly calm as I replied, that's your choice, Dad. You've made it clear who you choose, your wife and her children over your own daughter. Just like you've been doing for years. Sandra gasped dramatically. How dare you? You ungrateful little witch. You've always been jealous of my children, always trying to come between us and your father. One more word, I cut her off, pulling out my phone, and I'm calling the police for harassment. Your choice. The threat of police involvement shut her up fast. Dad started gathering the few belongings he'd left behind, working in tense silence. No one spoke as he packed his things into boxes, as he carried them to the car, as he made his final trip through the house where he'd raised me. He didn't say goodbye. Neither did any of them. They just got in their car and drove away, leaving nothing but tire tracks in the driveway. That was 3 months ago. I'm writing this from my dorm room at Northwestern University, over 1,000 miles from home. The house is being managed by Anderson Real Estate. They found good tenants, a young family with 2 little girls. The rental income more than covers my college expenses and lets me focus on my studies without worrying about money. I hear bits and pieces about Dad through mutual friends. He's renting a 3-bedroom apartment across town, still at his job with the fancy title and good salary. Sandra got the renovation she always wanted, new granite countertops and stainless steel appliances in someone else's kitchen. James finally found a job, though I hear he still lives at home. Melissa dropped out of college, but started a fashion blog. They're living their lives, and I'm living mine. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I look at old photos from before Mom died. Back when Dad's smile reached his eyes, and family meant something different. I wonder if we'll ever find our way back to being father and daughter again. I wonder if he ever thinks about me, if he regrets his choices, if he misses me like I sometimes miss him. Maybe someday Dad will realize what he lost. Maybe we'll find a way to rebuild what broke between us. Or maybe we won't. Either way, I know now that I'm stronger than I ever thought possible.